Nuremberg, October 1st, 1946. The air inside the Palace of Justice is suffocating, heavy with anticipation. For 10 long months, the eyes of the world have been fixed on this courtroom. Behind the benches sit the remnants of a fallen empire, 21 men once hailed as the architects of Nazi Germany's war machine. Now, they stand broken, waiting for their fate. The silence is pierced as the sentences are read aloud. Crimes against peace. War crimes. Crimes against humanity. The words echo like a verdict not just on the men in the dock, but on an entire regime that drowned Europe in blood. When the reading reaches Alfred Jodl, Hitler's trusted strategist, the man who signed orders condemning millions, the chamber tightens. The tribunal's judgment is clear: death by hanging. It is a brutal twist of fate. These generals and ministers, who once commanded armies and nations, are denied the honor of a soldier's execution. No firing squad. No battlefield glory. Instead, they are condemned to the rope, a punishment reserved for criminals, not warriors. The message is deliberate: the world no longer sees them as soldiers, but as monsters. Outside, the city of Nuremberg still lies in ruins, bombed to rubble by the very war these men unleashed. Families pick through ashes, children wander streets of broken stone, survivors search for food among shattered walls. And in the middle of this destruction, justice prepares its stage. For Alfred Jodl, the nightmare has only begun. His final journey will not end with dignity. It will end with horror, a death so drawn out and grotesque that even those hardened by war will never forget what happened when the trapdoor opened beneath him. Alfred Joseph Ferdinand Jodl was born on May 10, 1890, in Würzburg, deep in the heart of Bavaria. Yet even at the moment of his birth, stigma marked his life. He came into the world out of wedlock. His father, a proud officer from a Bavarian military family, refused to marry Alfred's mother, Therese, because she was the daughter of a farmer. For 9 years, the boy carried the quiet burden of illegitimacy until his parents finally wed after his father's retirement. Only then did Alfred bear the Jodl name. He grew up in a world shaped by military tradition. His younger brother, Ferdinand, would follow the same path into the army. His uncle Friedrich was a philosopher, reminding the family that intellect and discipline walked hand in hand. From an early age, Alfred was taught that duty to Germany was paramount, and that obedience was the highest virtue. By July 1910, the young Jodl was already serving in the Bavarian Army's 4th Field Artillery Regiment. Ambitious, diligent, and precise, he impressed his superiors quickly. Within 2 years, he was promoted to lieutenant. The outbreak of the First World War would test his mettle. At Saarburg in 1914, he was wounded in the thigh, confined to recovery for months, before returning to the front to prove himself again. For bravery, he earned the Iron Cross. The war ended in defeat, and with it, a humiliation Jodl never forgot. The Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of land, pride, and its once mighty army. For men like Jodl, it was a wound deeper than any battlefield scar. He remained in uniform, climbing through the shrunken Reichswehr, driven by one desire: to restore Germany's honor. It was a path that would bind his fate to Adolf Hitler. The 1920s were years of quiet preparation. Germany lay shackled by the Treaty of Versailles, its army reduced to 100,000 men, its pride trampled. Yet behind closed doors, in classrooms and secret offices, officers like Alfred Jodl worked to defy those restrictions. He taught war history and tactics, his lectures carrying not just lessons of the past but seeds of a future resurgence. The Reichswehr was more than a defeated army, it was a school of vengeance. By 1932, Jodl had risen to major under the watch of Wilhelm Keitel. Together, they operated within the shadows of the Truppenamt, an office designed to disguise the continued existence of the banned German General Staff. Under Jodl's guidance, military exercises were cloaked as sports clubs, pilots were trained in glider associations, and paramilitary militias rehearsed the art of infantry combat. The outward shell was peace. The reality was preparation for war. When Hitler seized power in 1933, Jodl's ambitions found their champion. The new Führer demanded rearmament, expansion, and vengeance against the victors of the Great War. Jodl provided the structure and obedience needed to make it happen. He played his part in the remilitarization of the Rhineland, in the secret building of divisions far beyond Versailles limits, and in laying the groundwork for Germany's rise from the ashes. By 1938, the gamble of rearmament erupted into bold action. Austria was swallowed in the Anschluss, the Reich expanding without a shot fired. Jodl was promoted again, transferred to command an artillery regiment in Linz, now German territory. Within a year, he was elevated to chief of operations at Hitler's high command, second only to Keitel. From that moment forward, Jodl was no longer a mere officer. He was Hitler's strategist, the man behind campaigns that would tear Europe apart. His rise was unstoppable, but every step upward carried him deeper into darkness. September 1939. The first shells thundered across the Polish border, and Alfred Jodl's ink-black orders became fire and blood. From his desk at the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the high command of the armed forces, Jodl translated Hitler's ambitions into operational commands. Every line he signed unleashed divisions, every directive bent millions of men toward destruction. Poland collapsed in weeks. France fell in months. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, spread terror across Europe. Yet for all the triumphs, Jodl's name became etched into a darker ledger. It was he who authorized the ruthless treatment of resistance fighters, branding them terrorists unworthy of the laws of war. It was he who signed off on the infamous Commissar Order, commanding the execution of captured Soviet political officers without trial. With each directive, the line between soldier and war criminal blurred and vanished. The turning point came with Operation Barbarossa, June 22, 1941. As German armies surged into the Soviet Union, Jodl's orders paved the way for annihilation. Entire villages were burned, partisans shot, civilians starved as the Wehrmacht advanced. The Eastern War was no campaign of honor. It was a war of extermination. In Hitler's War Council, Jodl stood at the Führer's side, advising, planning, calculating. He was not a battlefield commander, but his pen was deadlier than artillery. Every order carried his signature of approval. Every atrocity carried his silent consent. And with every decision, Jodl bound himself tighter to Hitler's fate. The victories that once seemed unstoppable began to crumble: Stalingrad, El Alamein, Normandy. Yet even in the Reich's final months, Jodl obeyed. To the bitter end, he remained Hitler's loyal strategist, a loyalty that would lead him to a courtroom in Nuremberg, and finally, to the gallows. By 1944, the empire that Alfred Jodl had helped design was collapsing under its own weight. The tide had turned. In the West, Allied bombers pounded German cities into smoking craters, reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble and ash. At night, the skies over Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden glowed orange, infernos consuming thousands. By day, the thunder of artillery rolled closer from the east, as the Red Army pressed relentlessly toward Berlin. Inside the Führerbunker and at the Wolf's Lair before it, Jodl still sat beside Hitler, drafting orders as if the Reich could be saved through sheer willpower. But the directives he signed grew increasingly desperate. Armies that no longer existed were ordered to advance, phantom divisions shuffled across maps. Hitler demanded miracles, Jodl supplied paper commands, knowing full well they were impossible. The Wehrmacht's iron machine was crumbling. On the Eastern Front, entire units were annihilated, swallowed by the Soviet steamroller. In the West, American, British, and Canadian forces carved their way through France and into the heart of Germany. By April 1945, Berlin itself was under siege. Still, Jodl obeyed. In those final days, he was tasked with negotiating Germany's surrender, a cruel irony for the man who had orchestrated its wars. On May 7, in Reims, France, Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces to the Allies. For him, it was the ultimate humiliation. The pen that had unleashed war now ended it in disgrace. When the fighting stopped, the reckoning began. The Allies wasted no time in rounding up the men who had built Hitler's empire. Jodl, stripped of his authority and uniform, was placed in handcuffs and led away. For the first time in his life, the general who had signed orders with unshakable certainty now had no control over his fate. His war was over. His trial was about to begin. The Palace of Justice in Nuremberg stood as a fortress of reckoning. Behind its walls, the victors of the war assembled not for vengeance alone, but to carve a line in history, that men who planned and unleashed global destruction would face justice. For Alfred Jodl, the courtroom became his battlefield, and the evidence against him was devastating. Day after day, prosecutors read his signed orders into the record. The Commissar Order, the Night and Fog Decree, directives that condemned resistance fighters to secret execution, policies that left prisoners of war to starve or perish in forced labor. The language was cold, clinical, but the consequences were written in blood. Millions of lives, destroyed by the stroke of his pen. Jodl's defense was simple. He claimed he was a soldier, bound by obedience, following orders issued from above. He argued that he had no choice, that disobedience would have meant his own death. But the tribunal rejected the excuse. They saw not just a man carrying out instructions, but a general shaping and enforcing them. A strategist who gave legality to Hitler's terror. On September 30th and October 1st, 1946, the verdicts were delivered. When the judgment reached Jodl, silence fell. He was found guilty on all counts: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. His sentence, death by hanging. To the world, it was justice. To Jodl, it was dishonor beyond comprehension. He had lived as a soldier, but he would not die as one. No firing squad. No final salute. Only the gallows awaited him, the rope reserved for criminals. That moment sealed his fate. Alfred Jodl, once the iron hand of Hitler's strategy, was now condemned to meet his end as a common criminal, stripped of the dignity he had spent a lifetime clinging to. October 16, 1946. The hour of reckoning had come. In the grey stillness before dawn, Alfred Jodl was led from his cell at Nuremberg prison. Gone were the crisp uniforms, the medals, the authority that once commanded millions. Now he wore a simple prison shirt and trousers, his hands bound tightly behind his back. Shackled footsteps echoed down the corridor, each one bringing him closer to the gallows. The execution chamber was stark and cold. A wooden scaffold had been built inside the prison gymnasium, its trapdoor freshly oiled, its ropes cut to length. One by one, the condemned men were brought forward: Ribbentrop, Keitel, Sorkel, and others. Each mounted the steps, and each fell through the trapdoor into silence. When Jodl's name was called, he moved stiffly, but not without composure. Perhaps he still clung to the discipline of a soldier, even now. Guards positioned him beneath the noose as the official read out his sentence. His lips tightened, his gaze fixed ahead. There would be no last salute. The hangman slipped the rope around his neck, pulling it taut. Moments later, the lever was pulled. The trapdoor yawned open, and Alfred Jodl dropped. But death did not come swiftly. The rope failed to snap his neck cleanly. Instead, he strangled slowly, his body convulsing, legs kicking against the void. The struggle lasted long minutes, the sound of choking filling the chamber until at last he went still. Witnesses shifted uncomfortably. Even hardened soldiers and journalists could not ignore the grotesque sight. The once mighty general, reduced to a twitching figure on a rope, had met his end not with honor, but with horror. Justice had been delivered, but the manner of his death left an image more haunting than heroic, a warning carved into memory that power, once abused, ends not in glory, but in disgrace. When Alfred Jodl's lifeless body was cut down from the gallows, the final chapter of his story was complete. His corpse, like those of the other condemned Nazis, was denied any grave or marker. It was cremated swiftly, his ashes scattered into the cold waters of the river Isar. There would be no headstone for admirers to rally around, no place where sympathizers could gather. History itself was to erase his name from the soil of Germany. Yet erasure could not cleanse the memory of what he had been. Jodl was not just a soldier who followed orders. He was the architect of strategies that unleashed destruction across continents. His signature appeared on orders that condemned countless prisoners, civilians, and soldiers to death without mercy. He had stood at Hitler's side in the planning rooms, lending his mind to the Führer's vision of conquest. And when confronted with the ruins of that vision, he pleaded ignorance, insisting he had known nothing of the camps. The world knew better. His execution was more than punishment, it was a statement. For the first time in modern history, generals and statesmen were held accountable before an international court, judged not by victory or defeat, but by the scale of their crimes against humanity. Jodl's fate became part of that precedent, a warning to every warlord, every tyrant, every officer who might one day claim to be only a servant of orders. But the image of his drawn-out, choking death remains the most haunting of all. It symbolized the collapse of the Nazi Empire itself, brutal, ugly, stripped of dignity. A man who once commanded armies reduced to silence on a rope. And so Alfred Jodl passed into history, not as a hero of Germany, but as a cautionary tale. His name, bound forever to betrayal, cruelty, and downfall. A reminder that justice, however delayed, will find even the highest of men, and drag them to the gallows.